Lockie here, and on today's OSS unboxing we're going to be taking a look at a new tool that was released last week, or at least there was an initial release, and that's the Cluster API provider for Azure. Now, what is the Cluster API provider, you might be asking yourself? Well, it's a way to use Cluster API to actually build a cluster on Azure. Now, it just so happens that I'm taking a look at the Azure one because I was interested to see how it works. Now, if you've looked at Cluster API, it's a way to declaratively define the way a Kubernetes cluster looks and ship a controller that actually knows how to implement that cluster based on that declarative declaration. So it's kind of a meta problem. Creating resources to define a cluster, then have a controller go and implement that. So I'm going to go through this fairly quickly, but just wanted to kind of show you the value prop here. So as mentioned, there was a release 0.1.0, which is why I actually took a look and did this recording. I wanted to have a play and see the power of Cluster API. So we're going to take it for a spin. Now, in this repo, so this is under Kubernetes SIGs, Cluster API provider Azure. If you want to get involved, I think it falls under SIG Cluster Lifecycle, and this would be a sub-project, so you can go and join those conversations or join in on Kubernetes Slack here. But it does actually ship with a getting started guide. So I've kind of done a lot of this in the interest of time. You can follow this to a T and it should land you in the same space. Actually, what you really need is a service principal, export these details, download some artifacts. So let's just take a look at them quickly. So basically we have a generate YAML script here, shell script that we actually run, and it generates everything into this out file. We will go through this in a minute. I'll kind of kick off the process. But what we basically do here is kick off clusterctl, which is a binary that we actually download from that repository as part of that release. Create cluster, giving it some logging, telling it to use kind as the provision mechanism. The provider is Azure, and I'm going to be feeding in these YAML files, which are actually the declarative resources that define what my cluster will look like. So we'll come back to that. I'm going to pop over here to a shell. In the top shell, I'm actually going to execute the command. Okay, so what it's actually running here is a kind cluster create named Cluster API. Now the interesting thing is, let's just do a watch on Docker PS. Okay, so it's been up for 10 seconds. So what's going to happen here is this clusterctl tool is, because I've told it to use kind, it's going to look for kind and it's going to run Kubernetes in Docker against my Docker for Mac. So it's building actually a control plane, because remember we have a meta problem here. We've got to build a control plane to put a controller to define these specific CRDs. I can take you through this process, which then get implemented to build a subsequent cluster. So I'm using Cluster API to create a cluster. And to do that, I'm spinning up a cluster in kind to create these custom resources and define a controller. We're going to go through all of that in a minute. So it's running. You can see a little bit of output here. So basically it's running. Now the only other thing I have over here is we're going to take a look is a resource group. So we should see a resource group called the capi-demo here. We will go and take a look at that, and we should see our cluster being built as it gets provisioned. So what we should see, I'm going to actually open another tab down the bottom here, just so we can introspect our kind cluster. So what I'd expect is once the kind cluster comes up on my Kubernetes for Mac, which we can see this control plane component coming up here, I would expect to see access to that cluster. So this will come up in just a moment and should probably give us a command to say Cluster API config path. Okay, so once this is ready, we should be able to get going. I think I might actually have, okay, yeah, so I'm actually going to kubectl version. See, so it is actually up and running. Kubectl get pods in the namespace, all namespaces. So what I've just done is export. We'll go back because I went really quickly. Get kubeconfig path name. So we've exported the kubeconfig, and now I can see that I can introspect the pods running on this cluster. Okay, so that's actually up and running now. What we could actually do is kubectl get CRDs. We should see that we have, here we go, all these custom resources. Provider specs, statuses, machine provider specs, statuses. So all these custom resources that we probably would have specific resources against that this controller is actually going to go and implement. Let's have a look in the namespace. This. Right. Okay, so basically this is the controller which is going to go and actually create all those resources on Azure. So if I pop over here, let's see, so we now see the CAPI demo, which is a resource group name that I defined before I generated the YAML file specifically. And we can actually see all these components coming up now. So now, while that is happening, let's just go back to what we've got over here. Now, it's all declarative, right? So here we have some service accounts, cluster roles. So here is specific for the add-ons, so the thing that's going to run in kube system namespace for all these service components. So we should be able to see if we go back over to here and I take a look at what are the pods. We should have WeaveNet, which I did actually see over here. Cluster.yaml, so here we have, what do we have? A cluster under clusters.kubernetes.io v1 alpha 1. Give it a name, give it some CIDR blocks, give it a service domain, and a few details on the provider spec, which tells it, hey, you're using Azure because there's Cluster API for other providers as well. And what do we got here? The machines. So this is probably, yeah, so you can see some versioning here. I have a machine list, I have a machine, it's a control plane machine, and a node. So I would expect a single master and a single node in this cluster. Provider components. So here are some different provider components that are actually created as well, so that all the bootstrapping goes ahead. Okay, so we should see these things all come up. We look like we have a public IP, we look like we have a control plane there. We should be able to pop this back down. So this initial command that I was running is still waiting for that control plane element to become available. And if I go back down and take a look at my logs here, we can see exactly what it's doing. Okay, creating a new public key, private key for signing service account users, creating kubeconfig for admin.conf. So this is going to sit here in a loop until it's normalized and made sure that everything that it needs to configure is configured and in the right state. We should see, do we have, yeah, virtual network. So I would expect this to take 3 to 5 minutes to fully have a cluster now. The only thing that I had to actually do before this was download the prerequisites, generate and create an SP, and I have actually a baseline cluster, which is really quite useful, and it's really interesting to see how Cluster API works and the promises it kind of holds. So I'm excited to see where Cluster API goes and all this work goes for all the individual providers. And it's really easy to go from zero to having a Kubernetes cluster without much heavy lifting, given that kind of great walkthrough. So whoever was responsible for writing that, kudos to you. Is there anything else while we finish this up? Okay, so we should end up with troubleshooting, accessing, so we should end up with a kubeconfig. Have we got it here yet? No, we haven't written that kubeconfig out in that directory. So this is still happening. Yeah, no, that hasn't actually been generated yet. I would like to see a node appear here. I still see the initial virtual machine, virtual network, public IP address. So I still only have the control plane node, and then maybe after the control plane node is done, we will move on. Alright, so you can see that the node has appeared. This should round out in the next couple of minutes, and this command should exit. That kind cluster should also go away, and we've actually configured and have access to a cluster API generated Kubernetes cluster. So very excited for what this project holds. Great work to everybody who's been working on this, and I look forward to playing with it a little bit more. Thanks for joining this. If you like, please subscribe, and we hope to see you again soon. Cheers.